Hi everyone, my name is Gal Schuster, and this is my presentation on Colson Whitehead for the author discussion. Thank you for joining me for a quick glimpse into this incredible author's life. Mr. Whitehead was born in quite a magical year, the year of 1969, or the year of the Woodstock Festival, where some of the greatest artists in history played, including the greatest guitarist of all time, Jimi Hendrix, as well as a few other well revered African American artists. Back to Colson Whitehead. He grew up in Manhattan and managed to get into prestigious Harvard College. During his college career and a bit later on, he worked for the Village Voice. And he mostly wrote reviews of TV shows, radio shows, restaurants, and all kinds of live shows that took place in his area of town. After college, he went on to writing works of larger volume, beginning with John Henry Days, which was published in 2001. This book was a finalist for the PEN Hemingway and the winner of the Quality Paperback Book Club's New Voices Award. That award is quite a mouthful. And as you can see here, you can see the cover of a book, and then we can move on to the next book that he wrote. He then continued to write small stories and anecdotes, beautifully influenced by his life in New York City. This book is called The Colossus of New York and was published in 2003. It was a New York Times notable book of the year. 3 years later, he published a fictional novel called The Apex Hides the Hurt, published in 2006. It earned him the PEN Oakland Award. He then went out into writing a book called Sag Harbor, which was a book that was based in 1985 and was published in 2009. And it was a novel about teenagers hanging out in Sag Harbor, Long Island, during the summer of 1985. This book was a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Fast forward a couple years later, and in 2011, he published a book called Zone 1, and it was about New York City in the case where there's an apocalypse. And so it talks about what it would look like and what it would be like in a post apocalyptic New York City. And this book was among his most successful works, and it achieved him the award of a New York Times bestseller. And it was, in fact, the number one New York Times bestseller in that year. Fast forward 8 years later to 2014, and Mr. Whitehead published a nonfiction recollection of a 2011 World Series in poker. This book, called The Noble Hustle, Poker, Beef Jerky, and Diff, was incredibly different than his different works, his previous works, both in style and in genre. It's quite amazing to find someone who knows how to write such different works and is brave enough to even attempt to do so. Because a lot of authors historically and authors in present day, they usually find a style that works for them or find a genre that works for them. And then they stick with that because that's what they're good at. But Mr. Whitehead was very brave and decided to try his hand also at nonfiction. And this was also a very successful work of his. Now, if you move forward 2 years later, then he published The Underground Railroad, which has won many awards and has been recommended by Barack Obama as the one of five books that he recommended for the summer for people to read, which is a huge honor. And especially because it's from an African American president, the first African American president in history. So that's pretty incredible. And it was also recommended by Oprah Winfrey. And so the reverence for this book just goes on and on. And as we have the pleasure of reading it right now, I totally understand why it's so well respected and has received the Pulitzer Prize. It's really quite amazing. And while we're on that subject, actually, I'd like to say a few thoughts of mine about what we've read so far. And beginning with a character, Ajari, I think it's really sad that she feels that liberty is something that's reserved for other people. And she doesn't believe that she can earn her freedom or can fight for her freedom. And she has sort of adopted it as her fate, that that's what she's meant to do, and other people are meant to be free. And that was really, really devastating to read. And then a bit later on in the book, it talks about how, or prior in the book, it talks about the journey on the ship and what happens along the journey. And the scenes that are described in this book are similar to scenes I've seen in movies about that era in US, in American history, and also described in other books by Frederick Douglass and other people. And it's just disgusting how people were treated just because of a shade of their color. And I think really it's almost unbelievable that people are still treated like that until today. And it's really disheartening to read such things. And another thing that really hit me like really hard was the scene where they're at the auction and Mr. Whitehead describes how she goes onto the stage and how the different people look at her and decide how much to pay for her. And if I remember correctly, she was bought for $240 or something ridiculous like that. And it's just, it's really sad to read that this has happened and that still until today, this is still happening in many different parts of the world. And the general populations remain silent. And this sort of builds on what was said this morning in the author discussion that was live this morning. One of the people, I think it was Dominique, brought up how people aren't necessarily silent. And Mr. Whitehead in the interview, in the video that was brought up, talked about how people do tend to stand silent when something bad happens. And I completely agree with that. We can take as a perfect example, terrible example, the Holocaust. Many countries, most countries, almost all countries of the world stood silent when a clear genocide, mass genocide was happening of 11 million people. And people that were judged because of their religion, because of their race, because of their disabilities. And so I think we do have to make an extra effort to make sure no one stands silent anymore. And we make sure things like this don't happen anymore. And the main takeaway is people need to understand that every person needs to be treated equal, no matter what, no matter where they come from, no matter what their background is. People need to be treated equal because we're all brothers and sisters in the end of the day. Okay, that's my rant. I'll move on to tell you some more about Mr. Whitehead. So then, for everyone biting their fingers, wondering when his next masterpiece will hit the shelves, it'll happen in 2019, this year. And the line of people eager for it to come out is, I'm sure, quite infinite. And it'll be called The Nickel Boys. He's had many different influences on the world besides writing. He's also written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Magazine, Harper's, Granta, and he's lectured at Princeton University, Columbia University, written at Vassar College and NYU. And here is a picture of a beautiful couple, him and his wife. And to the left hand side, you can see Oprah Winfrey here endorsing his book, saying how incredible of a work he has made. And I want to thank you all for joining me for this presentation. And here, over And here's the woke side. Thank you.